Hi everyone, welcome back to Steve's View. For decades, Americans were told a simple story. If companies could produce goods more cheaply overseas, everyone would benefit. Consumers would pay lower prices, businesses would earn higher profits. The global economy would become more efficient, and free trade would make the world more prosperous. For a long time, that story seemed convincing. Store shelves were full, inflation stayed relatively low. American companies became some of the most profitable corporations in history. Wall Street celebrated globalization as one of the greatest economic success stories ever created. But over the past few years, something changed. A pandemic exposed how dependent America had become on foreign factories. Wars reminded policymakers that weapons can't be produced overnight. Rising tensions between the United States and China forced Washington to ask uncomfortable questions about supply chains, rare earth minerals, semiconductors, pharmaceuticals, and critical infrastructure. Suddenly, one idea began replacing another. Instead of asking only, how can we make products cheaper? America started asking, what happens if we can't make them at all? That shift may be one of the biggest changes in American economic thinking since the end of the Cold War. At the end of May, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent delivered a speech at the Reagan National Economic Forum titled, "When America Slept." Whether you support President Trump or not, the speech deserves attention because it wasn't simply about tariffs. It wasn't just another campaign speech. It outlined a broader philosophy that is increasingly shaping how many policymakers, Republicans, and even some Democrats view the relationship between economics and national security. At the center of Bessent's argument was one sentence: economic security is national security. It's a simple phrase, but it carries enormous implications. For decades, American policymakers often treated economics and national security as two separate worlds. Trade agreements were negotiated primarily to increase economic efficiency. Companies were encouraged to build global supply chains wherever costs were lowest. Manufacturing moved overseas because investors rewarded lower production costs and higher quarterly profits. The assumption was that markets would solve almost everything. If one supplier failed, another would appear. If one country became unstable, companies would simply relocate production somewhere else. Efficiency became the highest priority. Bessent argues that this assumption was fundamentally flawed. According to his speech, America didn't suddenly become vulnerable during COVID. The pandemic simply exposed weaknesses that had been building for decades. When hospitals struggled to obtain masks and protective equipment, when shortages appeared across countless industries, when supply chains froze almost overnight, Americans discovered that many essential products were no longer made in the United States. That realization changed the conversation. The issue wasn't just economics anymore. It became a question of national resilience. This is probably the strongest part of Bessent's argument. He's asking Americans to rethink what economic strength actually means. Is a country truly wealthy if it imports nearly everything that matters during a crisis? Can a nation call itself secure if it depends on geopolitical competitors for critical minerals, advanced electronics, pharmaceutical ingredients, or military components? Those questions sound obvious today, but 20 years ago, they would have been considered protectionist. One of the biggest changes in Washington over the past decade is that these questions are no longer confined to conservative circles. President Trump emphasized reshoring manufacturing during his first administration. President Biden signed major industrial policies aimed at expanding domestic semiconductor production and clean energy manufacturing. Different presidents have used different language. Different parties have pursued different methods, but both administrations recognize the same strategic reality. Some industries are simply too important to leave entirely to global market forces. That's a remarkable shift. For nearly 30 years after the Cold War, globalization was treated almost as an unquestionable good. Today, both parties increasingly accept that efficiency alone cannot be the only goal. Resilience matters. Security matters. Redundancy matters. In many ways, America is rediscovering something previous generations already understood. During World War II, America's greatest advantage wasn't simply that it had tanks or airplanes. Its greatest advantage was that it could build more. Factories could expand production almost overnight. Automakers became aircraft manufacturers. Civilian industries transformed into military suppliers. Industrial capacity itself became a strategic weapon. That history explains another important point Bessent makes. Manufacturing isn't just about creating products. It's about preserving capability. When factories disappear, countries don't simply lose jobs. They lose engineers. They lose skilled workers. They lose suppliers. They lose specialized knowledge. And perhaps most importantly, they lose the ability to rapidly scale production during emergencies. Those capabilities are incredibly difficult to rebuild once they're gone. We've already seen examples of this. During the pandemic, governments around the world competed for medical supplies. More recently, conflicts in Eastern Europe and the Middle East have highlighted another reality. Modern warfare consumes enormous quantities of ammunition, missiles, drones, and replacement equipment. Production capacity that seems excessive during peacetime can suddenly become indispensable during war. This is why conversations about manufacturing today are no longer limited to economists. They're happening inside defense departments. They're happening in intelligence agencies. They're happening in national security councils. Because industrial capacity is increasingly viewed as part of national defense. At this point, however, it's also important to recognize where Bessent's argument becomes more political. He places much of the blame on the globalization policies that accelerated after China's entry into the World Trade Organization. There is certainly truth in the argument that American leaders underestimated China's ability to become a manufacturing superpower. Many policymakers assumed that economic integration would naturally produce political convergence. History proved that assumption overly optimistic. But globalization's consequences were more complicated than simply one country's rise. American corporations voluntarily moved production overseas. Investors rewarded short-term profitability. Consumers consistently chose lower prices. Automation reduced manufacturing employment even inside the United States. Countries like Mexico, Vietnam, India, and others also became major manufacturing centers. In other words, America's industrial transformation wasn't caused by a single decision or a single country. It resulted from decades of interconnected economic choices. That distinction matters because solving the problem will also require more than one solution. Picking up where we left off, this is where the debate becomes even more interesting. If America's industrial decline wasn't caused by one event, then rebuilding American manufacturing won't be solved by one policy either. This is where President Trump's economic agenda enters the conversation. Supporters often describe his policies as America First. Critics frequently call them protectionist. But underneath those political labels lies a much broader question. What should the federal government actually do when market incentives no longer align with national interests? For decades, Washington largely accepted the idea that government should avoid directing industrial development. The market would decide which industries survived, which factories closed, and where companies invested. That philosophy produced extraordinary innovation in many sectors. But it also produced unintended consequences. America became exceptionally good at designing products while gradually losing some of its ability to manufacture them. Wall Street flourished. Silicon Valley flourished. Yet many industrial towns continued to decline. Millions of manufacturing jobs disappeared. Communities built around steel mills, auto plants, and machine shops struggled to replace the economic ecosystems they had lost. Whether one blames globalization, automation, corporate decisions, or government policy, the result became impossible to ignore. That's why today's discussion isn't simply about bringing back factory jobs. It's about rebuilding strategic capacity. This explains why recent administrations have focused on industries that were once considered too expensive to produce domestically. Semiconductors, rare earth processing, battery manufacturing, pharmaceutical ingredients, shipbuilding, critical minerals, artificial intelligence infrastructure. These sectors aren't being prioritized because they're politically fashionable. They're being prioritized because policymakers increasingly believe they are essential to maintaining America's long-term strategic independence. This is where I think Bessent makes another important observation. He argues that America spent too many years measuring success almost entirely through consumption. If consumers could buy cheaper products, that was considered a victory. If stock prices continued rising, the economy was assumed to be healthy. Gross domestic product became the primary scorecard. But GDP doesn't tell the entire story. A nation can generate impressive economic growth while quietly allowing key industries to disappear. It can enjoy lower prices today while becoming more vulnerable tomorrow. That's why economists have started paying more attention to a concept that wasn't discussed nearly as much 20 years ago: economic resilience. Resilience isn't about maximizing efficiency. It's about surviving disruption. Imagine two supply chains. One is extremely efficient. Everything arrives exactly when it's needed. Costs remain low. Warehouses stay nearly empty. Profits remain high until something unexpected happens. A pandemic, a war, a natural disaster, a geopolitical conflict. Suddenly, the entire system stops working. Now imagine a second supply chain. It costs more. Some production remains domestic. Inventories are larger. Suppliers are more diversified. From a purely financial perspective, it appears less efficient. But when a crisis arrives, it keeps functioning. For decades, policymakers mostly rewarded the first model. Today, many increasingly favor the second. That shift represents one of the most important changes in modern economic strategy. Of course, none of this means globalization has failed completely. International trade remains one of the greatest drivers of innovation and prosperity in modern history. No serious economy can or should attempt to produce absolutely everything within its own borders. That isn't realistic, nor would it necessarily make countries stronger. The real question isn't whether America should trade with the world. The real question is which industries should never become overwhelmingly dependent on geopolitical competitors. That's a much narrower and much more practical conversation. It's also a conversation happening far beyond the United States. Japan is reshoring critical industries. The European Union is investing heavily in semiconductor production. India is expanding domestic manufacturing. South Korea continues strengthening strategic supply chains. Countries across the world are reaching remarkably similar conclusions. Globalization isn't ending. It's evolving. Governments are becoming more selective about where efficiency is acceptable and where resilience must take priority. This brings us back to tariffs, one of the most controversial aspects of Trump's economic policy. Supporters view tariffs as leverage. Critics see them as taxes on consumers. The reality is more complicated. Tariffs alone rarely rebuild an industrial base. If factories face high energy costs, labor shortages, complicated permitting processes, and inadequate infrastructure, tariffs by themselves won't solve those problems. Likewise, subsidies alone aren't enough. Neither are tax incentives, nor are government grants. Rebuilding industrial capacity requires an entire ecosystem: workers, technical education, reliable infrastructure, affordable energy, stable regulations, long-term investment, research institutions, provided capital, public policy. Every one of those pieces matters. That's why I believe the most valuable part of Bessent's speech isn't any individual policy proposal. It's the broader framework he's trying to establish. For years, American economic debates often treated trade policy, industrial policy, defense policy, and national security as separate conversations. Increasingly, Washington no longer sees them that way. The economy is becoming part of national security strategy. National security is becoming part of economic strategy. Whether Republicans or Democrats occupy the White House, I expect this trend to continue. Different administrations will disagree about how aggressively government should intervene. They'll debate tariffs, tax policy, subsidies, environmental regulations, labor rules, trade agreements. But I suspect very few future presidents will return to the assumption that strategic industries can simply be left entirely to global market forces. That era appears to be ending. In many ways, Bessent's speech is less about defending one administration than it is about declaring the end of an old economic consensus. The consensus that lower costs always outweigh strategic risks. The consensus that supply chains will always function smoothly. The consensus that manufacturing location doesn't really matter. Events over the past several years have challenged each of those assumptions. Whether because of COVID-19, because of growing strategic competition with China, Because of wars disrupting global trade, or because of rapid advances in technologies like artificial intelligence, governments have rediscovered something previous generations rarely forgot. Economic strength isn't measured only by what a country consumes. It's measured by what it can build. It's measured by what it can invent. It's measured by what it can produce when the unexpected happens. That's ultimately why I think this speech deserves attention. Not because every argument is beyond debate. Not because every policy recommendation will necessarily succeed. And certainly not because one political party has all the answers. It deserves attention because it reflects a profound shift in how America increasingly understands power itself. For decades, economic success was largely defined by efficiency, globalization, and financial performance. Today, another set of priorities is emerging alongside those traditional measures. Security, resilience, industrial capacity, technological leadership, supply chain independence. These ideas are no longer confined to academic journals or think tanks. They're shaping legislation. They're influencing investment. They're changing corporate strategy. And they're redefining what economic leadership may look like in the 21st century. Whether this new approach ultimately strengthens America's economy remains an open question. History will provide that answer. But one thing already seems clear. The debate has fundamentally changed. America is no longer asking only how to become wealthier. It's asking how to remain both wealthy and secure in a far more uncertain world. And regardless of where you stand politically, that's a conversation that isn't going away anytime soon. Thanks for watching.